February 24, 1986. Los Angeles. A city of lights, opportunity, and secrets. But in one quiet neighborhood, a nightmare was unfolding behind the closed door of a modest home. Sherry Rasmussen, a 32-year-old nurse, was found dead in her own living room. Shot multiple times. Her life ended suddenly, violently, leaving a community stunned and a family shattered. At first, police thought it was a robbery gone wrong. Nothing seemed out of place, except the obvious: Sherry was gone, and her husband, Robert Rasmussen, was left with questions no one could answer. Who would enter a home in the middle of the night and take the life of a woman with no enemies? For decades, that question haunted investigators. The trail went cold. Leads dried up. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen became one of Los Angeles's most baffling unsolved cases. But the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Stephanie Lazarus. A respected LAPD detective, ambitious, admired by colleagues, a woman who knew the law, and knew how to bend it. She had a history with Robert Rasmussen, an old affair, a lingering obsession. And somewhere in her mind, Sherry Rasmussen had become a threat, an obstacle that could not be allowed to remain. That night in February 1986, Stephanie entered Sherry's home. It wasn't random. It wasn't careless. It was calculated. A plan executed with precision, born of jealousy, rage, and the dangerous belief that love justified murder. For more than 2 decades, the case sat cold. Sherry's family searched for answers. Friends wondered what really happened. And the city moved on, unaware that one of its own officers carried a deadly secret. Then, decades later, forensic science began to speak. DNA evidence, overlooked in the chaos of 1986, became the key. The truth could no longer hide. Stephanie Lazarus would be identified, charged, and eventually brought to justice. This is the story of obsession, betrayal, and a murder that went unsolved for over 20 years. This is the story of the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Before her name became linked with headlines and courtrooms, Sherry Rasmussen was simply Sherry, a daughter, a sister, a nurse, a wife, a woman with a life full of promise. Born and raised in California, Sherry was the kind of person everyone described as warm, caring, and attentive. Friends remembered her laughter, her easy smile, and her generosity. She had a quiet strength, the type that drew people in without demanding attention. By the time she reached her early 30s, Sherry had built a life many would admire. She worked as a nurse in Los Angeles, dedicating long hours to caring for others. Her profession reflected her nature: attentive, responsible, and compassionate. She was someone who saved lives for a living, and yet, the one life she couldn't protect was her own. Sherry had married Robert Rasmussen, a man who shared her dreams and ambitions. Together, they built a home, filled it with hope, and began the quiet routines of married life. There was comfort in the familiarity of their neighborhood, the rhythm of workdays and weekends, the laughter of friends gathered for dinners or small celebrations. Despite her responsibilities, Sherry made time for the people she loved. She nurtured friendships with a devotion that left a lasting impression. Colleagues described her as the type of nurse who never left a patient feeling neglected. Friends recalled her calls just to check in, her willingness to listen, her unspoken kindnesses that often went unnoticed. Sherry was not someone who lived recklessly. She wasn't prone to conflict. She didn't seek drama. She followed her routines, took pride in her work, and valued the relationships in her life. To those who knew her, she embodied stability, trust, and sincerity. But in February 1986, all of that changed. Her life intersected with something dark, something she could not have anticipated. There were whispers and memories of someone who once knew her husband intimately, Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD detective, ambitious and admired. Stephanie had a history with Robert Rasmussen. A lingering obsession, a dangerous fixation that neither time nor distance had erased. Sherry was entirely unaware. She went about her days, trusting the world around her, believing that her home was a sanctuary. And it was, until the night of her murder. Sherry's final hours were like any other. She went to work, came home, and followed her usual evening routines. She cooked, tidied, spoke with friends or family, never imagining that her life was about to be taken in the most violent way. Her home, a place of comfort and security, became the scene of a premeditated crime. The tragedy of Sherry Rasmussen is not only in the violence of her death but in the innocence of her life. She lived fully, loved sincerely, and trusted deeply. That trust, that very human quality, became the vulnerability that cost her everything. Her death shocked her community. Friends, family, and colleagues struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the image of a victim on the evening news. Her laughter, her warmth, her kindness, all contrasted with the brutality of her final moments. And yet, even in death, Sherry's life reminds us of who she was, more than a victim, more than a headline, more than a story. She was a person, full of potential, full of light, whose absence left a void that could never be filled. Sherry Rasmussen's story is a reminder of how quickly normalcy can be shattered. How a life built on trust, love, and dedication can be destroyed by obsession and jealousy. Her story is not only a story of murder but of the life that once was, and the injustice of a life cut tragically short. Stephanie Lazarus was, by all appearances, a rising star in the Los Angeles Police Department. Ambitious, disciplined, and highly respected, she had earned her place among some of the city's most promising officers. Colleagues admired her confidence, her skill with investigations, and her unwavering commitment to the badge. Born and raised in California, Stephanie was intelligent and driven. She moved through life with determination, always striving to be the best at whatever she did. Ambition defined her early years, the awards, the accolades, the respect of her peers. On the surface, she seemed to have it all, a promising career, admiration from friends, and influence in a city where opportunity and danger often intersected. But beneath the exterior of professionalism and respectability, there was another side of Stephanie Lazarus, a side that was dangerous, obsessive, and deeply fixated on a past that refused to stay buried. Stephanie had once been romantically involved with Robert Rasmussen, Sherry's husband. The relationship had ended long before Sherry entered the picture, but the memories, the jealousy, the unresolved emotions, lingered. Obsession is subtle. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, with lingering thoughts, private recollections, and silent comparisons. And in Stephanie's case, that obsession grew into something far darker. As Robert's life moved on, as he married Sherry and built a new home, Stephanie's feelings shifted. Jealousy, unacknowledged and unchecked, began to dominate her thoughts. She watched from the sidelines, calculated, patient. She had access to knowledge and power most people could never imagine. She understood investigation techniques, surveillance, and the ways to manipulate evidence. And in her mind, she began to craft a plan, one that would forever change the course of Sherry Rasmussen's life. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She waited. She studied. She plotted. Every detail mattered, the timing, the location, the opportunity. Her professional training gave her tools that made her dangerous, knowledge of police procedures, understanding of forensic evidence, and the ability to move within her own department without suspicion. By February 1986, her obsession had reached a boiling point. Robert Rasmussen had a new life, a new wife, Sherry, and Stephanie's jealousy could no longer be contained. In her mind, Sherry had to be removed, erased from the equation. The love she once felt for Robert twisted into rage, and rage, in turn, became a plan. It was premeditated. Deliberate. Cold. Stephanie's access to knowledge and skill made her a predator few could see coming. She knew how to stage, how to manipulate, and how to leave traces that would mislead investigators. For decades, her plan succeeded. The murder went unsolved. Police investigated the scene as a possible burglary, never suspecting one of their own. Stephanie remained above suspicion, a trusted officer, while the truth lingered just out of reach. And yet, obsession has a way of revealing itself. The very traits that allowed Stephanie Lazarus to succeed professionally, her intelligence, her persistence, her meticulous nature, were the same traits that eventually led to her downfall. Modern forensic technology, patient investigators, and careful analysis would, decades later, expose the truth. Stephanie Lazarus, the decorated LAPD detective, the respected colleague, the ambitious officer, had committed one of the most chilling crimes Los Angeles would ever see. Her story is not only about a killer's mind but about how obsession, jealousy, and unresolved desire can twist a life of potential into a life of destruction. February 24, 1986. A quiet Los Angeles evening, the city alive with its usual rhythm, the hum of cars, the distant chatter of neighbors, the subtle pulse of life continuing unaware. Inside a modest home on South Maywood Street, Sherry Rasmussen was completing her evening routine. Dinner prepared, phone calls made, and the comfort of a familiar space surrounding her. She was unaware that outside, shadows of obsession were closing in. Stephanie Lazarus had planned this night carefully. For months, she had observed, waited, and analyzed every detail of Sherry's life. She knew the routines. She knew when Sherry would be alone. She knew the layout of the neighborhood. Her training as a police detective gave her the tools to act without detection, to approach a crime scene with the precision of someone who understood the inner workings of law enforcement. That evening, Stephanie entered the neighborhood, her mind focused on one goal. Every step was calculated. Every decision deliberate. She parked her car a short distance from Sherry's home, remaining unseen. She approached the house with the confidence and composure of an officer, a predator masking itself as authority. Sherry never saw her coming. Inside, she likely carried on with normal tasks, oblivious to the danger approaching. She may have heard a soft sound outside, or perhaps she did not notice at all. By the time Stephanie entered, the confrontation had begun. The door opened, words may have been exchanged, accusations, questions, perhaps desperate pleas, but the obsession inside Stephanie allowed no room for hesitation. Stephanie drew a weapon. Her actions were precise, controlled, and deadly. Multiple shots rang out, echoing through the quiet neighborhood, piercing the still night. Sherry fell. Her life, once vibrant and full of promise, ended in an instant. A home that had once been a sanctuary became a crime scene, silent except for the faint sounds of the city outside. After the act, Stephanie staged the scene carefully. She understood investigation procedures, the ways evidence could mislead detectives, the importance of appearing uninvolved. She left no footprints of panic, no signs of personal involvement beyond what could be plausibly explained. For decades, the murder remained unsolved. Investigators initially treated it as a burglary or random act of violence. Sherry's family searched for answers, haunted by the question, who would do this? Stephanie returned to her life, continuing her career, maintaining a facade of professionalism, all while harboring the secret that would one day shock the city and the police department itself. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen is a chilling reminder of the dangers of obsession and jealousy. It is a story of calculated intent, of a predator hiding in plain sight, and of a life taken in a place that should have been safe. Her story, though marked by tragedy, would not be forgotten. After the night of February 24, 1986, the Los Angeles Police Department was faced with a puzzle. Sherry Rasmussen was dead, her life stolen violently, and the evidence left behind seemed sparse. Initial investigators treated the scene as a burglary gone wrong, a tragic but seemingly random act of violence. Sherry's husband, Robert Rasmussen, and her family were left with grief and confusion. They wanted answers, but the trail was cold. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and the killer had left almost no trace. The LAPD, pressed by the family and by the natural urgency of a homicide investigation, combed the neighborhood, questioned friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. But leads were thin. The early investigation focused on possible intruders. Detectives interviewed neighbors, looked for signs of forced entry, and checked for fingerprints. Yet nothing concrete emerged. The initial theories, a random act, a robbery, a burglary, made sense on the surface, but failed to explain the precision and personal nature of the crime. For decades, the case remained unsolved. The LAPD's Homicide Division rotated detectives through the file, re-examining evidence as new technology emerged, but each effort seemed to end at a dead end. Sherry's family endured unanswered questions, anniversaries marked by absence, and a haunting uncertainty that no one could explain. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus continued her life in law enforcement. She remained a respected officer within the LAPD, praised for her diligence, leadership, and professional accomplishments. No one suspected that one of their own carried the secret of Sherry Rasmussen's murder. For over 20 years, the killer walked free, living a life of authority and trust. But the science of investigation did not stand still. In the 2000s, advances in DNA technology began to reopen cold cases across the country. Investigators recognized that biological evidence collected at crime scenes decades earlier could now be analyzed with unprecedented accuracy. The LAPD began revisiting the Rasmussen case, meticulously reviewing files, photographs, and preserved evidence. One detail, long overlooked, would eventually break the case open. DNA collected from the crime scene, stored carefully by forensic teams, matched profiles of potential suspects. Investigators focused on connections, people who had motive, opportunity, and means. And slowly, the picture began to clarify. Stephanie Lazarus's name surfaced. Her previous relationship with Robert Rasmussen, combined with the evidence, pointed investigators toward a startling conclusion. It was a revelation that stunned both the LAPD and the public. A decorated detective, someone trusted to uphold the law, was implicated in a crime so violent and calculated that it defied belief. The investigation, which had once seemed hopeless, was now alive with possibility. Detectives painstakingly pieced together the timeline, the relationships, and the evidence that had been ignored or misinterpreted for years. Sherry Rasmussen's murder was no longer a cold case, it was a matter of justice waiting to be served. The years of waiting, the decades of uncertainty, the haunting silence, all of it led to a moment where the truth could no longer be hidden. What had once seemed like a random, unsolvable tragedy was about to become one of the most shocking revelations in LAPD history. December 2009. More than 23 years had passed since Sherry Rasmussen was murdered. Decades in which her family lived with unanswered questions, in which investigators chased leads that went nowhere, and in which the killer walked freely, unchallenged, within the city she once called home. But time and science have a way of revealing truth, even when it hides behind years of doubt. DNA evidence collected at the scene in 1986 had been carefully preserved. Advances in forensic technology finally allowed investigators to re-examine the evidence with unprecedented precision. The breakthrough was shocking. The DNA matched Stephanie Lazarus, a decorated LAPD detective, someone who had once been trusted to uphold the law, someone who had walked the same streets of Los Angeles enforcing justice. Stephanie Lazarus was brought in for questioning. She arrived at the station under the guise of routine questioning, unaware that investigators had pieced together a timeline, collected witness statements, and corroborated evidence from decades prior. Her career, her reputation, the life she had carefully curated, all were at stake. Detectives approached the interview with caution. Stephanie was intelligent, meticulous, experienced in interrogation herself. They knew they had to rely on facts, on evidence, and on the subtle cracks in her composure. Hours passed. Questions were asked. Answers were measured. And yet, the weight of decades of concealment began to press upon her. The stories she had told herself, the justifications she had rehearsed, they began to unravel. Finally, Stephanie Lazarus confessed. She admitted that her jealousy over Robert Rasmussen had driven her to the house that night in February 1986. She described how she entered the home, how the confrontation unfolded, and how she fired the fatal shots that ended Sherry's life. Her words were precise, factual, chilling in their detail. Investigators listened carefully, recording every admission, noting every nuance, aware that this confession was the culmination of decades of patience and perseverance. The confession shocked the city. A respected detective, whose life had been dedicated to enforcing the law, was the perpetrator of one of the most notorious unsolved murders in Los Angeles history. Colleagues, friends, and the public struggled to reconcile the image of the officer they knew with the truth she had confessed. For Sherry's family, the confession was a bittersweet victory. Decades of grief, uncertainty, and unanswered questions finally gave way to justice, but the pain of loss remained unchanged. No confession could restore the life that had been stolen, no words could erase the years of waiting, wondering, and mourning. Stephanie Lazarus was charged with first-degree murder. She was arrested, booked, and held without bail, her life irrevocably changed by the truth she could no longer hide. In that moment, after decades of silence, the scales of justice began to tip. The murderer, hidden in plain sight, had finally been unmasked. The confession did not undo the past, but it ensured that Sherry Rasmussen's story would no longer be a mystery. It was a moment that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chapter in which truth, persistence, and science had triumphed over time, secrecy, and deception. Sherry Rasmussen's life had been stolen, but her name, her story, and the justice finally served would not be forgotten. The arrest of Stephanie Lazarus in 2009 sent shockwaves through Los Angeles and the nation. A decorated LAPD detective charged with murdering Sherry Rasmussen decades earlier was a story few could comprehend. And now, the city would watch as the case moved into the courtroom, where decades of grief, evidence, and obsession would be examined under the unyielding scrutiny of the law. The trial began with a heavy weight in the air. Courtroom seats filled with journalists, neighbors, friends, and family. Cameras flashed, capturing the tension, the anticipation, and the faces of those seeking justice for Sherry. For her family, every day of the trial was a reminder of the years stolen, the anniversaries marked by sorrow, and the questions that had haunted them for decades. The prosecution painted a meticulous portrait of premeditation. Stephanie Lazarus, they argued, had allowed jealousy to consume her. Her obsession with Robert Rasmussen had grown over the years, festering into rage. The evidence, the letters, the DNA, all pointed to a plan executed with precision. The prosecution emphasized her knowledge as a police officer, the skills she used to approach and commit the crime, and the deliberate actions she took to mislead investigators for decades. The defense, in contrast, sought to portray Stephanie as a professional who had been misunderstood. They argued that the murder was not premeditated in the sense of a calculated plan and attempted to cast doubt on motive, intent, and the interpretation of the forensic evidence. Yet, the weight of decades-old secrets, corroborated by modern science, proved difficult to dispute. Witnesses took the stand. Former colleagues spoke of Stephanie's career, her reputation, and her demeanor. Forensic experts explained how DNA evidence, long preserved, connected her directly to the crime scene. Family members recounted Sherry's life, her warmth, her kindness, and the tragedy of her untimely death. Each testimony painted a vivid contrast, the life that was lost, and the calculated intent that ended it. Days turned into weeks. Hours of testimony, cross-examinations, and legal arguments unfolded with painstaking detail. The jury listened, absorbing decades of evidence compressed into weeks of trial. They weighed motive, opportunity, and the chilling confession that had already revealed Stephanie's role in the crime. Finally, after deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, disbelief, and solemn recognition of the years lost. For Sherry Rasmussen's family, the verdict was both a conclusion and a beginning. Decades of unanswered questions had found resolution. Justice had been served, yet the wounds of loss remained. The life that had been stolen could not be returned, but acknowledgement, accountability, and closure had finally arrived. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus stands as one of the most compelling examples of how obsession, jealousy, and calculated intent can destroy lives. It also illustrates the power of persistence, modern forensic science, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Sherry Rasmussen's name, her story, and her life would forever be remembered. Not only as a tragic victim but as a symbol of how truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually come to light. The story of Sherry Rasmussen does not end with a verdict. It does not end with arrests, confessions, or life sentences. It ends in memory, in reflection, in the quiet echoes of a life that was stolen far too soon. Sherry was more than a victim. She was a nurse, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman whose life touched countless others in ways both large and small. Her laughter, her kindness, her dedication, all of it remains, though shadowed now by the tragedy of her murder. For decades, her family lived in the shadow of uncertainty. Anniversaries were marked by absence. Holidays were dimmed by grief. The question that haunted them was simple yet unbearable: why? Why did this happen? Who could commit such an act, and why had justice taken so long? And then came the breakthrough. Decades later, DNA evidence, meticulous investigation, and the persistence of detectives finally revealed the truth. Stephanie Lazarus, a trusted LAPD officer, had ended Sherry's life. The revelation was shocking, almost unbelievable. A colleague, a peer, someone sworn to protect the public, had committed one of the most premeditated and calculated acts of violence imaginable. Stephanie's arrest, confession, and eventual conviction brought justice, but they could not bring back what had been lost. Sherry's family finally had answers, yet the absence remained, a hollow space that no verdict could fill. The case also forced the city and its law enforcement agencies to confront uncomfortable truths. A murderer had walked among those sworn to protect, manipulating the very system designed to prevent crime. The LAPD reevaluated policies, internal oversight, and the ways evidence is preserved and investigated. In many ways, Sherry's death changed not just lives but institutions. Yet, amid the tragedy and betrayal, there is a reminder of resilience. Sherry's story endured because people refused to forget. Because investigators never stopped searching. Because her family never let silence claim her memory. Justice, though delayed, arrived, a testament to persistence, patience, and the power of truth. And still, her story serves as a warning. Obsession can lurk unnoticed. Jealousy can fester silently, growing until it explodes in violence. People we trust, even those in positions of authority, are capable of darkness. The world is not always as safe or predictable as it seems. But in reflection, there is also hope. Science evolves. Investigators improve. Communities demand accountability. Even decades later, the light of justice can reach through shadows of secrecy, uncovering the truth and honoring the memory of those lost. Sherry Rasmussen's name will forever carry weight, a reminder of both tragedy and perseverance. She is remembered not just as a victim, but as a woman who lived fully, loved deeply, and left an imprint on those around her. Her murder, though dark, also illuminates the value of memory, of vigilance, and of never allowing injustice to remain hidden. Her story compels us to listen, to observe, and to act, so that even in the face of cruelty and obsession, truth may prevail. In the end, Sherry's life, though stolen, remains significant. Her story is a quiet echo across decades, a lesson in the fragility of trust, the danger of obsession, and the enduring power of justice. Sherry Rasmussen's life mattered. Her story matters. And though the years have passed, the memory of who she was, and the reminder of the consequences of unchecked obsession, will never fade. If Sherry Rasmussen's story left an impression, consider subscribing to hear more true crime cases told in this reflective, cinematic style. Click the bell to be notified of new episodes, and join us as we uncover the truth behind real crimes, the lives affected, and the lessons that echo long after the headlines fade. Every story is a reminder of the fragility of trust, the danger of obsession, and the enduring power of justice. Subscribe, listen, and remember with us. May 25, 1996. California State University, San Luis Obispo. A night like any other on a college campus, students laughing, music spilling from dorm rooms and parties, the energy of youth carried on warm spring air. Kristin Smart, a bright-eyed freshman, was ready to end her first year on a high note. She had spent the evening at a party, friends, laughter, and the beginnings of college memories she would carry with her forever. But that night, one simple decision would change everything. Kristin chose to walk back to her dorm. Alone. Just a few blocks. A familiar route. Safe, she thought. But the world does not always reward caution, and the streets that night held shadows she could not see, dangers she could not imagine. No one saw Kristin after that. Not the people leaving the party, not the night shift janitor, not the passing cars along the quiet streets. She simply vanished. Her disappearance was immediate, jarring, and inexplicable. Friends waited for her at the dorm. Hours passed. Calls were made. Panic slowly replaced hope. And then, the realization set in: Kristin Smart had disappeared without a trace. The campus was thrown into chaos. A freshman, bright and ambitious, vanished into the night. Students, friends, and faculty scrambled to understand what had happened. Police were called. Witnesses were questioned. A search began, lights flickering through dorm halls, flashlights sweeping the streets, volunteers combing neighborhoods. But nothing. No clue. No evidence. No sign of Kristin. And then came the whispers. Rumors. Speculation. The familiar fear that grips every community when someone disappears under mysterious circumstances. Who could have done this? Why? Was it random, or was it someone she knew? Someone she trusted? The questions multiplied, and the answers remained out of reach. For weeks, months, even years, the case remained cold. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved on. And yet, Kristin's family refused to give up hope. They tirelessly advocated, appearing in media interviews, distributing flyers, demanding justice. Every year, every day, they kept her memory alive, reminding the world that she was not just a missing person, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend whose life mattered. Decades would pass. Police would revisit the case, analyzing evidence with new forensic technology. Investigators would uncover inconsistencies in statements, connect long-forgotten details, and slowly, painstakingly, piece together the events of that fateful night. And then, finally, the breakthrough: new evidence, witness testimony, and careful detective work pointed to the person who had been hiding in plain sight for all these years, someone who seemed ordinary, unassuming, trusted by many, yet capable of a crime that shocked a community and haunted a family for more than 25 years. This is the story of obsession, deception, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It is a story of Kristin Smart, a young woman whose life, dreams, and potential were stolen in a single, dark night. And it is a story of the truth eventually finding its way, no matter how deeply it is buried. Tonight, we begin with her disappearance. We walk the streets of San Luis Obispo, follow the unanswered questions, and uncover the events that led to one of California's most haunting true crime cases. This is the murder of Kristin Smart. Before the darkness of that night descended, Kristin Smart was simply a young woman with a life full of potential, dreams, and promise. Born in 1977 in a quiet California town, Kristin grew up surrounded by the love of her family, parents who encouraged her curiosity, a younger brother who looked up to her, and a circle of friends who admired her sincerity and warmth. Kristin was intelligent, outgoing, and full of energy. She had an infectious smile, a laugh that could light up a room, and a compassion that made people feel seen. Teachers described her as attentive, diligent, and determined, someone who took her responsibilities seriously but also knew how to enjoy life. Friends remembered her as the kind of person who would stay up late talking, offering advice, or simply listening when someone needed it most. Her first year at California State University, San Luis Obispo, was meant to be the start of something new, a chance to explore, grow, and chase her ambitions. College was a place where she could spread her wings, make new friends, and prepare for a future that seemed bright and promising. She had chosen a major she loved, participated in campus activities, and became known among peers for her friendliness and charm. Kristin's family noticed how much she had blossomed. She was confident yet approachable, independent yet deeply connected to those she loved. Her parents often spoke of her plans for the future, a career that would allow her to make a difference, a life filled with meaningful relationships, and experiences that would shape her into the person she hoped to become. And yet, in a world that often feels safe, vulnerability can hide in plain sight. Kristin's optimism and trust in others made her approachable, but it also left her exposed to those who might seek to exploit her kindness. She was unaware, in the final days of her life, that danger was not only real but close by, lurking in someone she likely encountered, perhaps even trusted. Kristin's routine was ordinary, almost comforting in its predictability. Classes, meals, study sessions, and time spent with friends, small, repeated rhythms that defined her day. She walked to and from campus events, often smiling and greeting those she passed. She trusted the people around her, believed in the goodness of her peers, and assumed that the world would treat her as she treated it, with respect, honesty, and care. But life is often cruel in the way it shatters normalcy. The night of May 25, 1996, was meant to be uneventful, a small college gathering, laughter, and the quiet joy of young adulthood. Yet, the ordinary can turn into the extraordinary, the safe into the dangerous, in the blink of an eye. Kristin's disappearance reminds us that even in familiar surroundings, unpredictability can change everything. Friends and classmates described her final hours in fragments, conversations remembered, steps retraced, glances exchanged. Each detail painted the picture of a vibrant, intelligent young woman whose life was abruptly stolen. Her personality, her dreams, and her hope for the future became stark contrasts to the tragedy that would soon consume her story. Despite the danger that awaited her, Kristin's life before that night is a testament to the person she truly was. She laughed, loved, studied, and cared, embodying the ordinary beauty of youth, ambition, and human connection. Her life reminds us that victims are never defined solely by the crimes committed against them. They are people first, with stories worth telling, memories worth preserving, and dreams worth honoring. Kristin Smart's life was more than the tragedy that would follow. It was filled with small victories, the forging of friendships, and the excitement of new experiences. She was a young woman full of possibility, untainted by the cruelty she would encounter, unknowing of the shadow that would follow her steps that fateful night. And so, as we explore the events that led to her disappearance, it is essential to remember who Kristin was, a bright, compassionate, ambitious young woman whose absence left a void felt by her family, her friends, and an entire community. Her story is not only a tale of crime but also a story of humanity, potential, and the fragility of life in the face of unforeseen darkness. Kristin Smart's life, though tragically cut short, is a reminder of what we fight to protect: trust, hope, and the dignity of the people we care about. And as we move forward into the investigation, the mystery, and the eventual search for justice, we carry her memory with us, honoring her as more than a victim, but as the remarkable person she was. May 25, 1996. A night that would forever mark the life of California State University, San Luis Obispo, and the hearts of Kristin Smart's family. It began innocuously enough. Kristin had attended a small campus party with classmates, the kind of gathering familiar to freshmen experiencing college for the first time: music, laughter, shared stories, and the sense of freedom that comes with independence. She mingled with friends, smiled, joked, and enjoyed the evening, unaware that the night would end in tragedy. As the party wound down, Kristin decided to walk back to her dormitory. The distance was short, just a few blocks, and she knew the route well. Friends offered to accompany her, she politely declined. It was an ordinary decision, one she had made countless times before: walk through the quiet streets, enjoy the night air, and return safely to her room. No one could know that this simple choice would lead her into the path of someone with dangerous intent. Witnesses later described seeing her begin the walk, seemingly alone, confident and unaware. The streets were dimly lit, typical of a college campus at night. Cars passed occasionally, students lingered nearby, yet no one intervened. It was the kind of night that felt safe, ordinary, unremarkable. And yet, danger was closer than anyone suspected. Paul Flores, a fellow student, had been present at the party. Friends described him as quiet, reserved, someone who had interacted with Kristin previously. On the surface, he seemed unassuming, even ordinary. But behind the facade was an obsession, a fixation that had begun months prior. As Kristin walked home, the night swallowed her. Witnesses reported seeing her disappear into darkness, but no one followed, no one noticed the subtle cues that something was amiss. The quiet streets became the stage for a crime that would shock a community and remain unsolved for decades. Inside that short span of time, Kristin encountered Paul Flores. The encounter, seemingly brief, would alter the course of her life forever. Accounts later revealed inconsistencies in statements, gaps in timelines, and behaviors that raised suspicion, but at the moment, everything appeared normal. The details of the encounter remain grim and tragic. Kristin, trusting, unaware, became vulnerable in an instant. What happened next would remain a mystery for years, shrouded by silence, deception, and the passage of time. Her absence was noticed too late. Friends returned to check on her. Hours stretched into panic. Calls were made. Searches began. Campus security and local police were notified. Teams scoured the area with flashlights, calling her name, retracing her steps, hoping to find a clue, a footprint, a trace, any sign that would lead to her. But the night had swallowed her, and the trail went cold almost immediately. The initial investigation faced challenges from the very beginning. Witnesses' memories were fragmented, timelines conflicted, and physical evidence was limited. The disappearance of a young woman in a college town seemed almost impossible to solve without concrete leads. And yet, Kristin's family refused to give up. Her parents and brother tirelessly appealed to authorities, contacted media outlets, and organized search parties, their hope unwavering even as years passed. For decades, the mystery of Kristin Smart's disappearance haunted those who knew her. The quiet streets where she once walked became a symbol of unanswered questions. Every May, the anniversary of her disappearance brought grief, reflection, and renewed determination from those who would not rest until justice was served. And then, finally, decades later, persistence, modern forensic techniques, and careful investigation began to peel back the layers of deception. Details overlooked, connections ignored, and inconsistencies in witness statements came into focus. What was once an unsolved disappearance became a case ready to reveal the truth. Kristin Smart's story reminds us of the fragility of life, the dangers of misplaced trust, and the courage required to never forget. A young woman's ordinary night turned extraordinary the most tragic way, and yet her memory would endure, carried by her family, friends, and the relentless pursuit of justice that would not be denied. Tonight, we continue her story, retracing the events that followed her disappearance, the investigation that spanned decades, and the breakthrough that would finally illuminate what happened on that fateful night. This is the story of Kristin Smart, not just the victim, but the person, the life, and the legacy left behind. The morning after Kristin Smart disappeared, the campus of California State University, San Luis Obispo, woke to confusion and fear. Students whispered, administrators scrambled, and the local police began what would become one of the most exhaustive investigations in the area's history. At first, it seemed as though Kristin might have simply wandered off, gotten lost, or chosen to leave on her own. But the details didn't add up. Friends reported her walking home from the party. No note, no explanation, no contact. The very normalcy of her routine highlighted the abnormality of her sudden disappearance. Law enforcement responded quickly, setting up search parties to comb the campus and surrounding neighborhoods. Officers and volunteers retraced her path from the party, checking dormitories, parked cars, and alleyways. Canvassing the area, police interviewed dozens of students and partygoers. Witnesses recalled snippets of conversation, fleeting glances, and someone leaving the party with her, though details were conflicting and vague. As hours became days, investigators began to piece together a timeline, no matter how fragmented. The final moments of Kristin's life were reconstructed from scattered eyewitness accounts. She was last seen walking toward her dormitory, alone, her figure disappearing into the dimly lit streets. Paul Flores, a student who had been at the party, quickly drew attention. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his statements, gaps in his timeline, and behaviors that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Yet, at the time, evidence was circumstantial. Without physical proof, the case could not move forward decisively. The investigation also included interviews with friends, roommates, and acquaintances. Detectives sought patterns, possible motives, and any hint of a suspect's identity. Tips poured in from concerned students and locals, but most led to dead ends. The trail seemed to vanish with Kristin herself, leaving investigators frustrated and family members desperate for answers. The media soon took notice, amplifying the story. Local news reported on the missing student, highlighting her bright personality, her family's anguish, and the ongoing search. Flyers were distributed across campus and the surrounding town. The story spread beyond California, capturing national attention. With public awareness came increased pressure on law enforcement to produce results, a pressure that would persist for years. Investigators explored all avenues. They considered the possibility of random abduction, disputes among students, or even foul play by someone Kristin knew. Each lead was scrutinized meticulously, but evidence remained elusive. Forensic technology in the 1990s had its limitations, and the available physical evidence did not yield clear answers. Weeks turned into months. The case became a haunting cold case. Kristin's family refused to relent, sending letters to the media, organizing search parties, and keeping her story alive. Their advocacy maintained public attention, ensuring that the investigation would not be abandoned. They demanded that law enforcement continue to explore every lead, no matter how small or inconvenient. Even as years passed, investigators occasionally revisited the case. New interviews were conducted, inconsistencies re-examined, and leads revisited in hopes of uncovering new information. Each attempt brought small glimmers of hope, though none had yet revealed the truth. The early investigation, though ultimately inconclusive, laid the groundwork for what would become a breakthrough decades later. Details documented in these initial interviews, overlooked by some at the time, would later prove crucial. Statements from witnesses, inconsistencies in timelines, and behavioral red flags became pieces of a puzzle that modern forensic science could finally solve. For Kristin's family, each day without answers was a mixture of grief and determination. They lived with uncertainty, but also with the conviction that the truth would eventually surface. The investigation, though slow, was never abandoned. The story of Kristin Smart's disappearance is a reminder of the challenges in solving crimes, especially when evidence is limited and time passes. But it also demonstrates the persistence of both law enforcement and loved ones. A persistence that would eventually unravel the decades-long mystery and reveal the chilling truth behind one night that changed everything. The early investigation did not solve the case, but it preserved the trail. Every detail recorded, every interview conducted, every lead explored became a step toward justice. And though the path was long, the foundation for the eventual resolution was being quietly built in the shadows of uncertainty. Next, we will explore the decades-long cold case, the continued search for justice, and the breakthroughs that finally brought answers to the mystery of Kristin Smart's disappearance. Years passed. Decades, in fact. California State University, San Luis Obispo, continued on with the rhythms of campus life, and the town slowly moved forward, but for Kristin Smart's family, the world had frozen the night she vanished. May 25, 1996, was no longer just a date, it was the day that changed everything. The case grew cold. Initial leads dried up. Witnesses' memories faded. Tips that once seemed promising turned to dead ends. The police files grew thick with reports, statements, and unverified sightings, evidence of a painstaking investigation that ultimately led nowhere. For Kristin's family, however, giving up was never an option. Her parents refused to let her story fade into obscurity. They made phone calls, held press conferences, and kept her name alive in media coverage. Flyers were distributed for years, commemorative campaigns organized annually, and every birthday, every anniversary, became a reminder to the public, Kristin Smart was not forgotten. The media occasionally revisited the case, often highlighting the chilling unknown, a young woman disappearing in plain sight, without a trace. The story was covered in local news, national outlets, and eventually true crime documentaries. Each retelling renewed interest and pressure on law enforcement. Meanwhile, investigators never stopped looking. Cold cases demand patience, persistence, and a willingness to revisit old evidence with fresh eyes. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic technology began to open new possibilities. DNA testing had improved dramatically, witness statements could be cross-referenced in ways that were impossible in the 1990s, and previously overlooked details could be re-examined. Detectives began re-interviewing individuals connected to the case. They noticed patterns and inconsistencies in statements previously dismissed as minor. Small, forgotten pieces of evidence, a vehicle sighting, a student's recollection, a discrepancy in a timeline, suddenly became critical. The breakthrough would come unexpectedly. Investigators revisited Paul Flores, the man who had been a person of interest since the initial investigation. His statements over the years were inconsistent. Relationships, behavior, and movement patterns were analyzed with modern investigative tools. Detectives began connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. Key witnesses came forward, offering insights they had kept to themselves for years. Perhaps fear had silenced them initially, or perhaps the passage of time had allowed reflection and courage. Their testimonies aligned in a way that formed a coherent narrative, revealing behaviors and motives that were once obscured. Forensic evidence, previously inconclusive, was re-examined using advanced technology. Investigators identified correlations between physical evidence and witness statements. Small details, footprints, timing, locations, all began to paint a picture that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. Kristin's family watched from afar as the case slowly moved toward resolution. Every small revelation was a glimmer of hope. Every interview and forensic test brought them closer to the answers they had sought for over 25 years. Then, the day arrived. Law enforcement announced arrests, shocking the community and capturing national attention. Paul Flores, and in some aspects his father, were implicated based on the meticulous work of detectives, witness cooperation, and scientific evidence. The people who had once eluded justice could no longer hide in plain sight. The breakthrough was not sudden, it was decades in the making. Patience, persistence, and innovation had finally converged to illuminate the truth. The disappearance that had haunted a family, a campus, and a community was no longer shrouded in mystery. The painstaking investigation, the cold case reviews, and the unwavering determination of law enforcement and loved ones had produced results. Kristin Smart's story reminds us that time alone does not erase justice. It demonstrates the power of memory, the importance of advocacy, and the persistence required to uncover truth. Even when a case grows cold, even when leads seem exhausted, the foundation laid by early investigations can eventually lead to resolution. And so, the story moves forward, from the haunting night of disappearance, through decades of uncertainty, into the moment where darkness begins to lift. Kristin's life, her memory, and her legacy are honored not just by answers, but by the relentless pursuit of justice. Next, we will explore the arrest, confessions, and legal proceedings, the dramatic culmination of decades-long investigation that finally brings the truth to light. May 2021. 25 years after Kristin Smart vanished, a quiet California town was about to witness a moment decades in the making. For years, the case had remained cold, frustrating investigators and devastating Kristin's family. But now, the relentless pursuit of justice had uncovered the truth. Paul Flores, once an unassuming student, now a man who had lived decades under the shadow of suspicion, was arrested. The arrest was carefully orchestrated, the culmination of years of investigation, witness interviews, and forensic analysis. Detectives had gathered enough evidence to connect him conclusively to Kristin's disappearance, and the law would finally move against him. For Kristin's family, the news was both shocking and relieving. Decades of unanswered questions, years of heartache and uncertainty, were suddenly met with clarity. They had never given up hope, tirelessly advocating for investigation and keeping Kristin's memory alive. And now, they would finally have some measure of justice. The arrest itself was quiet. No dramatic chase, no violent confrontation. Paul Flores was taken into custody and transported to the local police station, his expression unreadable, his life about to be irrevocably altered. Investigators knew that the interrogation that followed would be delicate. Flores was experienced in presenting calm, controlled behavior, and every word spoken would be scrutinized. Inside the interrogation room, detectives began a methodical questioning. They laid out evidence, inconsistencies, and witness accounts. The aim was not just to gather information, but to confront him with the truth, a truth that could no longer remain hidden. Hours passed. Paul Flores remained largely silent, his responses measured. Yet the investigators persisted, presenting details, timelines, and facts that had been meticulously compiled over decades. They observed subtle shifts in his demeanor, tiny cracks in the composure he had relied on for years. Eventually, the pressure bore fruit. Flores began to reveal information, reluctantly at first, then with increasing detail. He admitted involvement in Kristin's disappearance. Though many details remained to be confirmed through further investigation and forensic corroboration, his statements provided the critical missing links that investigators had long sought. The confession shocked the community. A man who had lived decades largely unchallenged was now forced to confront the reality of his actions. Friends, acquaintances, and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of the ordinary, familiar figure they knew with the dark truth revealed in his own words. For Kristin's family, the confession was bittersweet. Relief mingled with grief. Finally, they had answers, but the pain of loss remained unchanged. No admission could restore the life that had been stolen, no words could erase the years of waiting, wondering, and mourning. Investigators documented every detail meticulously. The confession would become a critical component of the prosecution's case, combined with decades of corroborating evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. The legal system now had the foundation it needed to pursue justice fully. The arrest and confession marked a turning point. Not just for the case, but for the family, the community, and the long shadow cast by Kristin Smart's disappearance. After 25 years of uncertainty, the truth had emerged, undeniable and unflinching. It was a reminder that persistence, patience, and meticulous investigation can prevail, even against time and deception. The missing piece of a decades-old puzzle had finally been placed, allowing a path toward accountability, resolution, and, finally, justice. Kristin Smart's life had been stolen, but her story was no longer a mystery. The arrest and confession ensured that the world knew the truth of what happened that night in May 1996, and that those responsible could no longer escape the consequences of their actions. In the coming chapters, the case would move into the courtroom, trials, legal battles, and the sentencing that would finally bring closure to the family and community. The story of Kristin Smart, long shrouded in silence, was about to reach its long-awaited resolution. The courtroom was tense. For decades, Kristin Smart's family had waited for this moment, hoping that justice would finally be served. After 25 long years of uncertainty, unanswered questions, and relentless grief, the trial of Paul Flores began. The story that had haunted a community was now fully under the scrutiny of the law. The trial opened with a recounting of that fateful night in May 1996. Prosecutors presented meticulously gathered evidence. Witness statements, forensic analysis, and the confession that had broken the decades-long silence. Each detail, carefully documented over years of investigation, painted a chilling picture of what had occurred that night. Flores's defense attempted to cast doubt on the timeline and reliability of witness statements. They argued that memories faded over time, that forensic evidence was circumstantial, and that decades-old recollections could not form a definitive narrative. But the prosecution countered with precision, demonstrating how meticulous investigation, corroboration, and modern forensic techniques created an unbroken chain of truth. Family members watched from the gallery, their emotions a mixture of grief, relief, and anticipation. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, every cross-examination brought them closer to a measure of justice that had been delayed for far too long. Witnesses took the stand, recounting memories of the night Kristin disappeared, moments once overlooked now gaining clarity. Investigators detailed how small inconsistencies in Flores's statements over the years had been analyzed and cross-referenced with physical evidence. It became clear that the man they had long suspected was responsible, and the depth of planning and deception involved shocked even those familiar with the case. The prosecution emphasized the human cost. Kristin Smart was not just a case file or a missing person report, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her life, her ambitions, and her potential were stolen. The courtroom felt the weight of those words, the gravity of a life ended too soon. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. Outside, the community held its collective breath, understanding the significance of the moment. This was not just about punishment, it was about accountability, about acknowledging the suffering of Kristin's family, and about ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. Finally, the verdict was delivered. Paul Flores was found guilty of Kristin Smart's murder. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and validation. Justice, though delayed, had been achieved. For the family, it was a bittersweet victory. No sentence could restore the years lost, the milestones uncelebrated, or the life cruelly cut short. The sentencing followed shortly after. Flores received a prison term reflecting the severity of his crime. The legal system had finally completed the arc of accountability that had begun so many years ago. For the family, this brought a sense of closure, an affirmation that their persistence, their advocacy, and their refusal to forget Kristin had mattered. Yet the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reminder of the resilience of those who seek truth, the importance of never abandoning a missing person, and the power of persistence in the face of injustice. The case highlighted the limitations of the past, the evolution of forensic science, and the courage required to confront darkness that hides behind familiar faces. Kristin Smart's life, though tragically short, became a catalyst for change, in law enforcement procedures, in cold case investigations, and in public awareness of missing persons. Her story underscored the necessity of never ceasing to ask questions, to follow leads, and to demand answers, no matter how much time passes. As the courtroom emptied, and the gavel's finality lingered, Kristin Smart's family could finally breathe, knowing that her story had been honored. Justice had been served. The darkness that had hung over her disappearance for a quarter of a century had been pierced by truth, persistence, and unwavering dedication. This chapter of Kristin Smart's story demonstrates that even when cases grow cold, even when time seems to obscure the path to justice, truth can emerge. And though the loss remains, the acknowledgement of guilt, accountability, and justice brings a measure of peace and the assurance that her life, her story, and her memory will never fade. Next, we will explore the reflection, legacy, and lessons of Kristin Smart's story, honoring her life beyond the crime, and the enduring impact of her memory on her family and the community. Kristin Smart's story did not end with her disappearance, nor with the trial and sentencing of the man who took her life. It continues in the memories of her family, the hearts of her friends, and the lessons learned by a community forever changed. For 25 years, her absence left an unfillable void. Birthdays, graduations, and milestones passed without her presence. Yet her family never allowed her to be forgotten. Their advocacy, their persistence, and their refusal to accept silence became a guiding force, not only in solving the case but in reminding the world that victims are never merely statistics. They are people with lives, dreams, and relationships, deserving of justice and remembrance. Kristin was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman full of potential, ambition, and hope. Her life, though tragically cut short, continues to inspire action, vigilance, and compassion. Through her story, families of missing persons found strength to keep searching, advocates found hope that persistence matters, and law enforcement saw the power of dedication, innovation, and unwavering focus. Her disappearance also serves as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in familiar spaces. College campuses, often perceived as safe havens, can hide threats beneath their ordinary facades. Kristin's story underscores the importance of awareness, of advocacy, and of community vigilance, even in environments we consider secure. The eventual breakthrough, the arrests, confessions, and conviction, demonstrates the tireless nature of justice. It shows that even after decades, the truth can emerge, that evidence, persistence, and careful investigation can pierce the darkness. While justice cannot restore a lost life, it affirms accountability, honors the memory of the victim, and offers a measure of closure to grieving loved ones. Kristin's legacy is not solely in the crime that ended her life, but in the lessons her story imparts. It teaches us to never give up hope, to keep asking questions, to demand answers, and to advocate for those who cannot speak for themselves. Her family's unwavering dedication exemplifies the power of love and resilience in the face of unspeakable tragedy. Communities remember Kristin not just for the tragedy of her disappearance, but for who she was: bright, kind, and full of life. The awareness generated by her story has strengthened protocols for missing persons, inspired true crime investigations, and educated generations on the importance of vigilance and advocacy. Her story, now fully told, invites reflection. It reminds us to value the people around us, to cherish the moments we share, and to recognize that even ordinary nights can be extraordinary in their consequences. And though her life was taken too soon, the memory of Kristin Smart endures, not as a symbol of fear, but as a reminder of courage, persistence, and the enduring power of truth. As we close this story, let us remember Kristin Smart as more than a case or a headline. Let us honor her as a young woman who lived, laughed, and loved. Let us carry forward the lessons of her life and the resilience of those who fought for justice on her behalf. And finally, let this story remind us that even in the face of darkness, persistence can illuminate truth, and hope can endure, long after tragedy has struck. Kristin Smart's story is one of memory, justice, and legacy. It is a testament to the strength of family, the determination of investigators, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to let a life be forgotten. This is Kristin Smart, remembered, honored, and never forgotten. Kristin Smart's story is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth can prevail. Her disappearance and the decades-long search for justice show the power of persistence, the importance of advocacy, and the enduring strength of family who refuse to give up. If this story has moved you, remember that true crime is not just about the mystery, it is about the lives affected, the families left behind, and the lessons we can carry forward. Every missing person has a story, every victim deserves to be remembered, and every community has a responsibility to keep asking questions, seeking answers, and ensuring that justice is not forgotten. By subscribing, following, or sharing these stories, you help keep the memory of Kristin Smart, and countless others, alive. You contribute to awareness, support advocacy for missing persons, and ensure that these cases remain in the public consciousness, because silence allows injustice to endure. Consider taking a moment to learn more about missing persons in your own communities. Support organizations dedicated to solving cold cases. Share resources, spread awareness, and honor the lives behind every headline. Small actions can create ripples that reach far beyond what we see, helping families who have waited far too long for answers. Kristin Smart's story is now known, her life remembered, and her legacy honored. But the fight for justice, awareness, and remembrance continues for many others. Be part of that effort. Stand with the families, honor the victims, and help ensure that no story is forgotten. Subscribe, share, and remember, because every life, every story, deserves to be heard.